In November 2022, Netflix released a documentary that the world's largest association of professional archaeologists formally asked them to delete or relabel as fiction. They didn't win that fight. The show stayed up. It became one of the most watched documentaries in the platform's history. Tonight, we're not just telling you what Graham Hancock found. We're telling you why an entire scientific field decided he was dangerous enough to fight back publicly, and letting you decide who's right.
And it's here that his theory takes its boldest turn. Hancock argues that before this catastrophe, there was already a sophisticated human civilization on Earth, not hunter-gatherers scraping by, but a genuinely advanced culture with its own knowledge of architecture, astronomy, and agriculture. A civilization old enough and unlucky enough to be standing directly in the path of this disaster. He believes the survivors of that impact, traumatized, scattered, stripped of their cities and their records, fled outward across the globe, and it was they who taught early astronomy, monumental building, and farming to the hunter-gatherer societies they encountered. In his telling, the sudden and often unexplained sophistication we see in early societies like ancient Egypt or Sumer isn't really sudden at all. It's inherited, passed down by refugees from a world we've completely forgotten.
Oppenheimer's argument, built substantially on genetic and linguistic evidence rather than speculative site visits, proposes that Sunderland supported a sophisticated Neolithic population, and that its inundation scattered those populations outward across Asia and the Pacific, carrying agricultural knowledge, boat-building skill, and, intriguingly, origin myths and flood stories with them, potentially seeding some of the same mythological flood patterns we discussed a couple of episodes back.
Mainstream archaeology and genetics researchers have engaged with Oppenheimer's work seriously, in a way that's noticeably different from how they've engaged with Hancock's, partly because Oppenheimer's claims are narrower and more tightly tied to testable genetic and linguistic data, rather than a sweeping global civilization theory, and partly because he arrived at the argument through his own primary research, rather than journalism assembled from other specialists' work. That doesn't mean Sunderland as cradle of civilization is universally accepted. It remains a genuinely contested minority position within population genetics, but it's treated as a serious scientific hypothesis worth arguing about in peer-reviewed journals, rather than dismissed outright the way Hancock's broader framework often is.
The contrast is worth sitting with. Two very different researchers, working in two very different parts of the world, both proposing that a sophisticated, now vanished society was scattered by rising post-glacial seas, seeding what came after. One gets published and debated inside mainstream genetics journals. The other gets a Netflix series and a formal letter of objection from the largest archaeological association in the country. The core idea isn't actually where the two men part ways. The method and the evidentiary standard behind it is.
Chapter 25. The Footprints That Quietly Rewrote a Continent. Here's a story that almost nobody outside archaeology circles has properly heard, and it might be the single freshest piece of information in this entire four-part series, because unlike almost everything else we've covered, this isn't a disputed fringe claim. It's a quiet, recent, thoroughly mainstream discovery that did something remarkable. It rewrote the official timeline itself, without any comet, without any lost civilization, using nothing more dramatic than fossilized footprints and careful dating. For most of the 20th century, American archaeology operated under something called the Clovis First model, the belief that the earliest humans arrived in the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago via a land bridge across the Bering Strait, named after a distinctive style of stone spear point first found near Clovis, New Mexico. For decades, this was treated as close to settled fact.
Then, at White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers studying an ancient lake bed found something extraordinary: a long trail of fossilized human footprints preserved in layers of sediment, alongside seed pollen that could be radiocarbon dated directly. When the results were published in 2021, they were almost hard to believe. The footprints dated to somewhere between roughly 21 and 23,000 years old, not 13,000, nearly 10,000 years earlier than the old Clovis first model allowed.
The finding was immediately and reasonably challenged. Some researchers raised a legitimate concern that the seed pollen used for dating might have absorbed older carbon from the lake water itself, artificially inflating the age. So a separate research team went back in 2023 and dated the same footprint layers using two entirely independent methods: radiocarbon dating conifer pollen instead of the aquatic seeds, and a completely different technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures how long ago quartz grains in the sediment were last exposed to sunlight. Both independent methods return dates consistent with the original, startling estimate.
Sit with what that actually means for a moment. Within the space of about 2 years, mainstream, thoroughly conventional archaeology, using nothing more exotic than footprints in old mud and standard dating technology, pushed back confirmed human presence in the Americas by nearly 10,000 years, overturning a model that had stood largely unchallenged for the better part of a century. No comet, no lost civilization, no accusations of institutional cover-up, just new evidence, rigorously tested twice, quietly and thoroughly changing the official story.
It's worth holding this discovery up directly against everything Hancock has argued across 4 episodes now, because it cuts in an interesting direction for both sides of this whole debate. It proves, plainly, that the official timeline of human history is not fixed in stone, and that genuinely startling revisions do happen, which is exactly the kind of institutional flexibility Hancock has spent 30 years arguing archaeology lacks. And at the very same time, it shows precisely how that kind of revision is actually supposed to happen, through direct physical evidence, independently retested by multiple methods until skeptics are satisfied, rather than through a sweeping, unifying narrative built from folklore, disputed rock formations, and contested radiocarbon dates from a single retracted paper. The system worked exactly the way its defenders say it's supposed to work. It just usually works quietly, one footprint at a time, instead of loudly, all at once.
Chapter 26: The Mound Nobody Can Agree On. In Adams County, Ohio, a quarter-mile-long earthen mound winds across a ridge in the unmistakable shape of an enormous serpent, its tail coiled and its open jaws appearing to clutch or approach an oval-shaped mound at its head. It's the largest surviving serpent-shaped effigy mound on Earth, and it's a genuine masterpiece of ancient landscape art, visible best from directly above, raising its own quiet mystery about how and why its builders designed something meant to be fully appreciated from a vantage point they themselves likely never had.
For a long time, archaeologists attributed Serpent Mound to the Adena culture, a Native American mound-building society active in the region roughly 2,000 years ago. Then, in the 1990s, new radiocarbon dating of charcoal recovered from within the mound produced a genuinely different result, suggesting a later construction date, around 1070 CE, connecting it instead to the Fort Ancient culture, a separate Native American society active roughly 1,000 years later than the original Adena estimate. The two dating campaigns haven't been fully reconciled since, and serious, mainstream archaeological debate about the mound's true age and builders continues to this day. When Ancient Apocalypse featured Serpent Mound in its second season, Hancock highlighted this genuine, ongoing dating controversy as evidence that archaeology's confidence about ancient American history is shakier than it presents itself to be, and floated the possibility of a still older origin connected to his broader Ice Age framework.
It's an enormous claim built on top of a real, accepted event. And that's exactly why it's so persuasive to millions of people and so alarming to professional archaeologists, because the foundation is genuine science and the building on top of it is something else entirely. We'll come back to exactly how contested that impact theory is a little later. For now, hold on to the shape of it, because every place we visit next is, in Hancock's telling, a fingerprint left behind by that lost world.
Archaeologists studying the site have pushed back on that extension specifically, while readily acknowledging the genuine dating dispute itself, pointing out that we have two competing radiocarbon dates 1,000 years apart from two well-documented Native American mound-building cultures is a completely different, much more modest kind of uncertainty than this might actually be an Ice Age structure 10,000 years older than either estimate. The site remains, without question, one of indigenous North America's most extraordinary works of art and engineering. The debate that actually exists in the professional literature is a genuine 100-year page of history, not the far larger gap Hancock's framework would require.
Chapter 27. The Other Alternative History. It's worth pausing here to place Hancock inside a wider family of writers, because he's often lumped together with a tradition that actually predates him by decades, and the difference between them says a lot about why Hancock has managed to stay taken semi-seriously in a way his predecessors mostly haven't. In 1976, a Russian-American writer named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, the first in a long series of books arguing that ancient Sumerian texts describe visits from an advanced extraterrestrial species called the Anunnaki, who Sitchin claimed genetically engineered early humans as a labor force and later inspired the god myths of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond. Sitchin built his entire case on his own translations and interpretations of Sumerian cuneiform tablets, translations that professional Assyriologists and Sumeriologists, the actual specialists trained to read this notoriously difficult ancient script, have overwhelmingly rejected as inaccurate, built on mistranslated words and invented meanings rather than the tablet's genuine content.
Hancock has been notably careful over 3 decades to keep real distance between his own work and Sitchin's. His lost civilization is entirely human, terrestrial, and grounded in a real, if disputed, physical catastrophe, not an extraterrestrial visitation resting on contested ancient translations. It's a meaningfully different kind of claim, evidentially speaking, even if casual critics frequently fold both writers into the same broad ancient mysteries bucket. That distinction is a big part of why Hancock has managed to get a seat at real credentialed tables, 4-hour debates with professional archaeologists, mainstream podcast appearances, a Netflix series treated as a genuine documentary rather than outright fiction, in a way Sitchin's Anunnaki theory largely never did. Hancock's claims, however contested, are at least built from the same kind of raw material professional archaeology itself works with: radiocarbon dates, geological surveys, published excavation reports. He's arguing about how to interpret real evidence. Sitchin, by the assessment of nearly every relevant language specialist, was working from evidence that wasn't real to begin with.
Chapter 28.
The people still looking for the comet. One last piece of the picture, because this story didn't stop moving after the big 2023 rebuttal we covered in Part 1. A loose network of researchers, formally organized under the name the Comet Research Group, and including several of the original scientists who proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis back in 2007, has continued actively publishing new studies, gathering new sediment samples, and responding directly to their critics' objections, arguing that the broader scientific rebuttal was too quick to treat the question as fully closed. Their position, consistently, is that the anomalous evidence, the nanodiamonds, the platinum spike, the sudden, unexplained extinction of a wide range of large Ice Age mammal species right around the same narrow window of time, deserves continued, serious investigation rather than a final verdict either way.
This matters for understanding where the story genuinely stands today, heading into whatever comes next in this series. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis isn't a closed case with Hancock simply refusing to accept the result. It's an active, ongoing, legitimately unresolved argument inside professional geology and planetary science, with credentialed researchers publishing on both sides, years after the final rebuttal was supposed to settle it. Hancock built an entire mythology on top of one side of that argument, but the argument underneath him, unlike most of what we've covered across these episodes, is still genuinely, professionally alive.
Chapter 29. The Shape of the Whole Story. 4 episodes in now, a shape has become fairly clear, and it's probably the most useful thing to carry away from all of this. There is a real, confirmed, thoroughly mainstream history of the world drowning and rebuilding itself after the last ice age, Doggerland beneath the North Sea, quite possibly Sunderland beneath the waters of Southeast Asia, entire coastlines and communities genuinely erased by rising water within a relatively short window of time. There is a real, ongoing, professionally unsettled argument about whether a comet helped trigger the coldest chapter of that transition. And there is a real, recent, quietly remarkable habit within mainstream archaeology itself of overturning its own settled assumptions the moment sufficiently strong new evidence turns up. Footprints in a New Mexico lakebed rewriting 10,000 years of accepted history in the space of 2 years, using nothing more mysterious than patience and repeated testing.
Graham Hancock has spent 30 years standing at the intersection of all of that real, confirmed uncertainty and building the biggest, most unifying story he can out of it. Sometimes that means highlighting a genuine, underappreciated mystery the field hasn't fully resolved. Sometimes it means reaching considerably further than the actual evidence goes. The honest answer, after 4 episodes, isn't a verdict. It's a habit worth keeping for anything you read or watch about the ancient world going forward. Ask every time exactly which part of the claim is the confirmed footprint in the mud, and which part is the story someone built on top of it.
That's where tonight's chapter of the story ends. Somewhere under the gray water of the North Sea, an old forest floor keeps its silence, exactly as it has for 8,000 years. Somewhere in New Mexico, a set of footprints, 21,000 years old, sits quietly in dried mud, waiting for the next question someone thinks to ask of it. And somewhere, right now, a small group of researchers is still out there, gathering samples, running tests, chasing one more piece of evidence in an argument that refuses to close. You don't need an answer tonight. You just need to let the questions settle, the way the sea eventually settles, over anything it takes. Good night.
Chapter 3. The pyramid inside the mountain. West Java, Indonesia. A hill called Gunung Padang. The name translates roughly to Mountain of Enlightenment or Mountain of Light. On its surface, terraces of megalithic stone, arranged in a way that's been recognized as an ancient sacred site for a very long time. Nobody serious disputes that there's something man-made here. The argument is about how old and how deep it goes. In the early 2010s, a team of Indonesian researchers, led by geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaya, began core drilling into the hill itself, not just studying the visible terraces on top, but sampling material from deep beneath them. Their claim, which made headlines around the world, was that the layers extended down far deeper than the visible stonework suggested, and that some of the material recovered from those deep layers returned radiocarbon dates stretching back over 10,000 years, potentially even older.
If true, that would make the oldest structure at Gunung Padang not merely older than the pyramids of Giza, older than agriculture, older, by Hancock's read, than the entire accepted timeline of human civilization. This is the site Hancock leans on hardest, and it's the one that produced the sharpest scientific backlash. In 2023, the study behind those extreme dates was formally retracted by the journal that published it, after other geologists argued the buried structures were more likely natural volcanic rock formations, and that the radiocarbon samples, organic soil, not carved stone, couldn't actually prove the layers above them were built by human hands at that depth. From the mainstream side, Gunung Padang is being described less as a lost megacity and more as a natural hill that people, at various points over thousands of years, added terraces and stonework to. From Hancock's side, the retraction itself is suspicious, evidence, he'd argue, of a field closing ranks to protect its own timeline, rather than following the data.
Neither side disputes that people once stood on this hill and built something sacred there. What they disagree on is a number, and depending on which number turns out to be right, it either quietly confirms what archaeologists already believed about the ancient world, or it rewrites the opening chapter of human history. Chapter 4: The Hill That Broke the Rules. Now travel roughly 4,000 miles northwest to a quiet hilltop in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. For most of the 20th century, archaeology operated on a fairly simple assumption. Monumental architecture, big, deliberate, organized stone construction, required farming first. You needed surplus food, settled populations, social hierarchy, before you had the spare labor and coordination to build something enormous. Agriculture, in other words, was supposed to be the engine that made civilization possible.
Göbekli Tepe broke that rule. Excavations beginning in the 1990s revealed massive carved limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall, arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with detailed carvings of foxes, snakes, boars, and birds. And radiocarbon dating placed the oldest layers at roughly 11,500 years old. That's older than Stonehenge by about 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by about 7,000. And critically, it predates clear evidence of organized agriculture in the region by a significant margin. This appears to be a monument built by hunter-gatherers, not farmers. This is one of the very few places in the entire debate where Hancock and mainstream archaeology actually stand shoulder to shoulder on the core fact. Göbekli Tepe is a genuine archaeological shock. It proved that large-scale cooperative building didn't require agriculture as a prerequisite after all, that hunter-gatherer societies were capable of far more organization and ambition than the old textbook model gave them credit for. That's not a fringe claim. That's accepted, mainstream, textbook revising science.
Where the two sides split is what to do with that fact.
Mainstream archaeologists treat Göbekli Tepe as proof that hunter-gatherers were smarter and more capable than we assumed, a correction to our estimate of a known kind of society. Hancock treats it as something more, a possible outpost or inheritance from the lost, more advanced civilization his Younger Dryas theory describes. Same site, same dates, two very different stories about who built it and why.
Chapter 5. The Cities Beneath the Waves. If Hancock's theory is right, if sea levels really did rise more than 100 meters as the ice sheets collapsed, then the most important evidence of a lost civilization wouldn't be sitting on a hilltop somewhere. It would be underwater, drowned along with the coastlines people once lived on. Off the coast of Yonaguni, a small Japanese island at the southwestern edge of the Ryukyu chain, divers in the 1980s found something strange roughly 75 feet below the surface, a massive rock formation with strikingly straight edges, flat terraces, and near 90-degree angles, features that at first glance look almost architectural. Some call it the Yonaguni Monument. Hancock has pointed to it as a strong candidate for a submerged Ice Age-era structure, proof that people were building monumental stonework in a location that's been underwater for thousands of years.
Geologists who've studied the formation largely disagree, arguing that the local sandstone naturally fractures along straight, angular plains, and that similar stepped rock terraces occur elsewhere along the same coastline with no human involvement at all. It's a genuine, ongoing scientific debate, not fully settled in either direction, which is part of why it keeps resurfacing in documentaries year after year. Hancock points to other underwater sites too, submerged structures off the coast of Dwarka in India, associated with Hindu legends of a sunken city once ruled by Krishna, and formations off the coast of Cuba that some researchers claimed in the early 2000s resembled an urban layout on the seafloor at a depth that would place it firmly within the last ice age. Both remain heavily disputed, and neither has produced the kind of conclusive, peer-reviewed confirmation that would settle the question either way. Good evening. If you're here, you've probably already heard the name, Graham Hancock, the man who says our history books have the wrong start date. That somewhere between the end of the last ice age and the first Egyptian dynasty, there's a civilization missing. One advanced enough to leave fingerprints on nearly every ancient culture on Earth, and then vanish so completely that we forgot it ever existed. You might have seen the Netflix series. You might have seen the debates, the arguments, the archaeologists calling it dangerous nonsense, the millions of people calling it the truth finally being told. Either way, you probably came away with a headline, not a full picture. Tonight, we're going to slow down and actually walk through it. The man, the evidence, the places, the fight. Not to tell you what to believe, to give you enough of the real story that you can lie back, let your mind wander over 10,000 years of human history, and form your own opinion as you drift off.
What's genuinely fascinating, regardless of which side of this you land on, is the pattern underneath it. Nearly every ancient culture on Earth, from Mesopotamia to India to Mesoamerica to Aboriginal Australia, carries some version of a flood myth, a story of a world before, destroyed by rising water, with a small group of survivors left to rebuild. Mainstream scholars generally explain this as a natural, near-universal human response to the very real, well-documented sea level rise that followed the last ice age, something virtually every coastal culture on Earth would have experienced and needed to explain. Hancock reads the same universal pattern as something closer to shared memory, folklore as a kind of oral time capsule, carrying the trauma of a single global event forward for 12,000 years.
Chapter 6. The War with Archaeology. Here's the part most videos in this space
skip entirely. And it's the part that actually makes this story worth thinking about, instead of just watching. When Ancient Apocalypse premiered on Netflix in November 2022, it became one of the platform's most watched documentary series almost immediately. And within weeks, the professional archaeological community responded with something unusually forceful. The Society for American Archaeology, the largest professional archaeology organization in the country, wrote formally to Netflix, arguing the series shouldn't be classified as a documentary at all, and asking for it to be relabeled as science fiction.
Their objection wasn't just about dates and rock formations. Archaeologist Flint Dibble, writing publicly about the series, argued that Hancock had effectively declared war on the entire discipline, accusing the field, episode after episode, of ignoring or actively suppressing evidence that didn't fit the accepted timeline. Critics pointed out that the show almost never presents the counter-evidence or the scientific consensus alongside Hancock's claims, leaving viewers with the impression of a lone truth-teller against a monolithic, secretive establishment, when the reality is closer to one man's interpretation set against decades of published, peer-reviewed, and openly debated research.
There's a sharper edge to the criticism, too. Several archaeologists and anthropologists argued that crediting a single lost advanced civilization for the achievements of places like the megalithic temples of Malta or the massive earthworks built by indigenous peoples in the Americas quietly implies that the actual builders, real historical peoples with names, languages, and descendants living today, weren't capable of it themselves. Experts studying the Pacific island of Pompeii were especially blunt about this when Hancock's claims touched their region, describing the theory as deeply disrespectful to the ancestors, who they say plainly did build those structures, and linking that kind of who really built it reasoning back to racially charged theories from the 19th century that were used historically to deny credit to non-European civilizations. Hancock has consistently rejected that accusation and has said publicly that he supports indigenous peoples and their history. His defenders argue the backlash proves his central point, that a well-connected academic establishment reacts with unusual hostility whenever someone outside it challenges the accepted timeline, and that shutting down a theory with words like dangerous and misinformation isn't the same as actually disproving it with better evidence.
And here's the piece that matters most for tonight, because it goes to the very heart of his whole theory, that Younger Dryas comet impact, the single catastrophic night his entire framework depends on. In late 2023, a large team of geologists, physicists, and climate scientists published what they described as a comprehensive scientific rebuttal of the impact hypothesis, arguing that, across more than a decade of testing, the physical evidence used to support a comet strike, certain rare minerals, particular chemical signatures and sediment layers, simply hasn't held up to independent replication, and that the abrupt cooling of that period can be explained through more conventional climate mechanisms, like a sudden influx of cold meltwater disrupting ocean currents, without invoking a comet at all.
That doesn't prove no impact ever happened. Science rarely closes a question that cleanly. But it does mean the foundation stone of Hancock's entire theory, the single night his whole lost civilization is built around, remains, at best, a genuinely disputed minority position within the scientific community, not settled fact. So, where does that leave us? A journalist with 3 decades of research and millions of readers, pointing at real, uncontested scientific mysteries. Göbekli Tepe, the pace of post-glacial sea level rise, the strange universality of flood myths, and building an enormous, unifying story on top of them. And an entire academic field publishing real, checkable research, insisting the foundation of that story doesn't hold,
while sometimes struggling to explain the genuine mysteries in a way that satisfies an audience of millions who feel correctly that something doesn't quite add up about the story they were taught in school. Both of those things can be true. That's not a cop-out. That's just where the actual evidence sits tonight.
Chapter 7. What if he's right? Before we close, sit with the question underneath all of this for a moment. Not who's right, something quieter. What would it actually mean for us, today, if there really was an advanced civilization before the one we know, and it vanished so completely that only fragments of it survive as myth and half-buried stone and strange coincidences in old carvings? It would mean first that human history isn't a straight upward line, not a steady climb from cave to city to spacecraft. It would mean the line has already broken once, that a sophisticated society can rise and be erased almost entirely in the space of a single catastrophic event, and that the survivors can end up starting over from something close to zero.
It would mean the achievements we're proudest of as a species, writing, architecture, astronomy, might not be things we invented so much as things we remembered, half-forgotten inheritances passed hand to hand across a broken world until someone finally wrote them down again and called it the beginning. And maybe that's the real reason this story has held on to so many people for 30 years, regardless of which side of the debate they land on. It isn't really about pyramids, or comets, or radiocarbon dates. It's about a very old, very human fear that everything we build, no matter how permanent it feels tonight, can be erased. And a very old, very human hope, sitting right next to that fear, that even if it is erased, something of it survives, in a story, in a shape carved into stone, in a myth a grandmother tells a child, about a flood and a world before, and the people who made it through.
Here's where we're going tonight. We'll start with who Graham Hancock actually is, because the story of how a foreign correspondent ended up rewriting prehistory is stranger than most people realize. Then we'll go to the heart of his theory, a single cold night, roughly 12,900 years ago, that he believes ended the first civilization before it could write its own history. From there, 3 places: a mountain in Indonesia that may or may not hide a 10,000-year-old structure, a hill in Turkey that broke the oldest rule in archaeology, and the ocean floor off the coast of a small Japanese island where divers found something that shouldn't be there.
Whether Graham Hancock has found real fingerprints of that lost world, or whether he's found an extraordinary, well-told story built from ordinary, explainable stone, the questions he spent 30 years asking are worth asking. Where do we actually come from? How much of what we know do we really know? And how much of it did we just inherit and forget where it came from?
Chapter 8. The Continent Under the Ice. Of everything Graham Hancock has proposed over 30 years, this is the claim that goes furthest, and it starts, oddly, with a 16th century map. In 1929, in the archives of the old imperial palace in Istanbul, historians rediscovered a fragment of a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis. The map shows the coastline of West Africa and South America with surprising accuracy for its era, and along the bottom edge, a stretch of coastline that some researchers, starting with a college professor named Charles Hapgood in the 1960s, argued matched the coastline of Antarctica's Queen Maud Land. The catch: Antarctica's coastline wasn't accurately mapped by modern science until the 1950s, using ice-penetrating radar.
If Hapgood was right, someone had mapped it accurately more than 4 centuries before anyone had the technology to see under the ice.
Hapgood didn't just leave it there. He proposed something much bigger, a theory called crustal displacement, the idea that the entire outer shell of the Earth can, under certain conditions, shift as a single unit around the molten layer beneath it, dragging entire continents into new positions relative to the poles over a relatively short span of time, geologically speaking. In his version of events, Antarctica wasn't always at the South Pole. It sat somewhere much further north in a temperate climate, until a crustal shift roughly matching the timeline of Hancock's Younger Dryas catastrophe dragged it violently south into the deep freeze it's locked in today.
Put those two ideas together, and you get Hancock's boldest single claim, that Antarctica is not simply a frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world. It's the resting place of his lost civilization, a green, habitable landmass where an advanced culture may have lived, mapped their coastline in detail, and then watched their entire home slide toward the pole and freeze over, all within a human lifetime.
It's worth sitting with just how far outside mainstream science this particular claim sits. Geologists overwhelmingly reject crustal displacement on this timescale. Plate tectonics, the accepted model for how land masses move, operates over millions of years, not centuries. And the physical mechanism Hapgood proposed has never been demonstrated to actually work the way he described. Most cartographic historians also offer a much simpler explanation for the Peary Race map's southern coastline, that it isn't Antarctica at all, but a compressed, somewhat distorted rendering of the South American coast curving eastward, drawn by a mapmaker working from fragmentary, second-hand source charts, the way many 16th century maps did.
But here's why this claim, more than almost any other in Hancock's work, has stayed alive in the public imagination for over 60 years. It doesn't ask you to squint at a single ruin or debate a single radiocarbon date. It asks a much bigger, much more romantic question. What if the ice at the bottom of our planet isn't hiding nothing? What if it's hiding an entire chapter of us?
Chapter 9. The Weathering on the Sphinx. Now to Egypt, and to a single, specific, deeply strange question. How old is the Great Sphinx of Giza, really? The official position, held by Egyptology for well over a century, is straightforward. The Sphinx was carved during the reign of the pharaoh Khafre, somewhere around 2500 BCE, as part of the same building program that produced his pyramid on the plateau behind it. Most of the supporting evidence comes from context, its position relative to Khafre's pyramid and valley temple, and a handful of inscriptions found nearby referencing his name.
In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch, at the time a professor at Boston University, was invited by the writer and Egypt researcher John Anthony West to examine the enclosure walls around the Sphinx, not the statue itself, but the trench carved out of the bedrock surrounding it. What Schoch found troubled him. The weathering pattern on those walls looked, to his trained eye as a geologist, less like the effects of thousands of years of wind-driven sand erosion, which produces a distinctive horizontal, scalloped pattern, and more like the effects of prolonged, heavy rainfall, deep vertical fissures, and rolling, wave-like undulations consistent with sustained water runoff over a very long period.
The problem, if he was right, is timing. Egypt's climate has been arid desert for roughly the last 5,000 years.
The last period in that region with the kind of sustained heavy rainfall needed to produce that erosion pattern was significantly earlier, pushing the Sphinx's original construction back potentially several thousand years before the accepted Khafre date into a much wetter climatic period. Schock went public with the theory in 1992, and it detonated a controversy that's still simmering more than 30 years later. Hancock seized on Schock's water erosion theory almost immediately, and it became one of the load-bearing pillars of his own broader argument. If the Sphinx really does predate Khafre by thousands of years, it becomes, in his reading, a surviving monument from exactly the kind of older, pre-catastrophe civilization his theory requires.
Mainstream Egyptologists pushed back hard, and their strongest counter-argument is a fairly simple one. Even if Schock is right that the weathering pattern looks like water damage, and many geologists dispute that reading too, arguing the pattern is still explainable through wind erosion acting on the specific, softer layers of limestone in that spot, a weathered rock face tells you nothing about who carved the statue sitting inside it, or when. The bedrock itself is far older than any civilization. Erosion on exposed stone can only tell you roughly when the surface was exposed to the elements, not who first shaped it, or whether it was later recarved, restored, or added to during Khafre's era, which would fit comfortably inside the accepted mainstream timeline of Egyptian history.
Then, and this is the part almost nobody covers properly, we'll sit with the other side, because the case against Hancock is just as fascinating as the case for him, and it comes from serious people with real credentials, not just internet noise. And we'll end with the question underneath all of it. Not is he right? Something quieter. What would it actually mean for us right now if he were? Get comfortable. This one's long, and it's meant to be.
Nearly all Egyptologists still date the Sphinx to Khafre's reign. Schock, more than 30 years on, still stands by his geological reading, and Hancock still treats it as one of the strongest single clues that Egypt's history, and by extension ours, starts earlier than the textbooks say.
Chapter 10. Stones That Shouldn't Move. 2 sites now, an ocean and a hemisphere apart, that keep showing up in this conversation because of one shared physical fact: the sheer size of the stone involved. High in the Bolivian Andes, at over 12,000 feet of elevation, sits Pumapunku, part of the wider Tiwanaku archaeological complex. Some of the cut stone blocks scattered across the site weigh well over 100 tons, cut with such precision, flat faces, perfect interior angles, matching cutouts across separate blocks, that some visitors have compared the level of finish to machine tooling rather than hand craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating of organic material found at the broader Tiwanaku site places significant construction in a period roughly 1 to 1,500 years ago, genuinely old, genuinely impressive, but nowhere near the Ice Age scale timescale Hancock's theory requires.
Mainstream archaeologists studying Tiwanaku have documented in real detail the actual quarrying and transport methods available to the culture that built it, including the use of copper and bronze tooling, wooden levers, ramps, and llama hide ropes, alongside evidence of unfinished blocks still sitting in the original quarry, mid-carving, giving researchers a rare direct window into the working method. Hancock's read is different. He points to the precision of the cuts and the sheer tonnage involved, and argues it points toward knowledge and capability inherited from somewhere or someone older and more sophisticated than the accepted timeline allows for.
Now travel to Lebanon, to Baalbek, and a platform built beneath a Roman-era temple complex. 3 stones here, known collectively as the Trilithon, are cut from limestone and each weigh somewhere in the region of 800 tons,
among the largest cut stone blocks ever incorporated into a building anywhere on Earth. A short distance away, in the same quarry, sits an even larger stone, never fully separated from the bedrock, weighing well over 1,000 tons, that researchers now generally refer to as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman.
The mainstream archaeological position is that these stones were quarried and set during the Roman period as part of an enormous, imperially funded expansion of an existing local temple site, an extraordinary feat of Roman engineering, using the kind of large-scale capstan, pulley, and ramp systems the Romans are independently known to have used elsewhere. Hancock again reads it differently, arguing that stones of this scale sitting beneath a much later Roman structure suggest an older foundation, built by an earlier and more capable civilization that the Romans later built on top of rather than created from scratch.
What's genuinely fascinating here, whichever side of the debate you land on, is that both Pumapunku and Baalbek represent real, still active engineering puzzles. Even mainstream researchers who confidently date these sites to their accepted historical periods openly acknowledge that moving stones of this scale with the tools known to be available at the time remains a genuinely difficult, actively studied problem, which is exactly the kind of gap that keeps a theory like Hancock's breathing, even where the radiocarbon dates themselves aren't seriously in dispute.
Chapter 11. The Memory of Water. We touched briefly on flood myths last time. Tonight, it's worth slowing down on just how strange the pattern actually is. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature on Earth, written in Mesopotamia roughly 4,000 years ago, contains a flood story, a god warning a chosen man to build a vessel, load it with his family and animals, and survive a flood sent to destroy humanity. The biblical story of Noah, written centuries later, follows an almost identical structure. The Mesoamerican Popol Vuh, sacred text of the Quiché Maya, describes an earlier age of humanity destroyed by a great flood, with a small number of survivors going on to repopulate the world. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, some of which researchers now believe may preserve genuine memory of coastline changes going back over 7,000 years, include stories of ancestral floods reshaping the land. Versions of the same basic structure, a world before, a flood, a handful of survivors, a world after, appear in the folklore of cultures on nearly every inhabited continent, most of which had no contact with each other at the time these stories were first being told.
The mainstream explanation is elegant, and it doesn't require a single global cataclysm at all. As the last ice age ended, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over several thousand years, not instantly, but fast enough in places to be noticeable within a single human lifetime, forcing coastal communities to relocate again and again as the water crept inward. Virtually every culture on every coastline on Earth would have lived through some version of this independently, and virtually every culture would have needed some way to explain it. A flood myth isn't a strange coincidence in that light. It's close to inevitable.
Hancock's reading layers something additional on top of that. He doesn't dispute the science of post-glacial sea level rise, but he argues the sheer consistency of the story structure, the recurring detail of an advanced or blessed world before, destroyed suddenly, survived by only a few, hints at something more specific than gradual coastal displacement, something closer to a shared trauma, passed down across the wreckage of a single lost culture, rather than dozens of unrelated cultures independently processing the same slow-moving environmental reality in similar ways.
Neither explanation requires the other to be false. It's entirely possible that both are true at once, that rising seas gave nearly every coastal culture its own flood story to tell,
and that somewhere in the deepest layer of that shared human memory, there's an older, more specific echo still waiting to be properly understood.
Chapter 1: The Journalist Who Went Looking for a Lost World. To understand why this story has so much gravity behind it, you have to start somewhere unexpected. Not a pyramid, not a jungle. A newsroom. Graham Hancock was born in Edinburgh in 1950, the son of a surgeon. He studied sociology, not archaeology, not geology, sociology, the study of how societies function. And for the first chapter of his career, he wasn't chasing lost civilizations at all. He was a foreign correspondent, writing for British newspapers and magazines, filing stories out of East Africa. His early books weren't mystical. They were about corruption, how international aid money disappeared into the pockets of the powerful instead of reaching the people it was meant to help. One of them, a sharp, well-reviewed critique of the aid industry, built him a reputation as a serious, credible journalist. A man who followed money trails and asked uncomfortable questions of powerful institutions.
What's genuinely fascinating here, whichever side of the debate you land on, is that both Pumapunku and Baalbek represent real, still active engineering puzzles. Even mainstream researchers who confidently date these sites to their accepted historical periods openly acknowledge that moving stones of this scale, with the tools known to be available at the time, remains a genuinely difficult, actively studied problem, which is exactly the kind of gap that keeps a theory like Hancock's breathing, even where the radiocarbon dates themselves aren't seriously in dispute.
Chapter 11: The Memory of Water. We touched briefly on flood myths last time. Tonight, it's worth slowing down on just how strange the pattern actually is. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature on Earth, written in Mesopotamia roughly 4,000 years ago, contains a flood story, a god warning a chosen man to build a vessel loaded with his family and animals and survive a flood sent to destroy humanity. The biblical story of Noah, written centuries later, follows an almost identical structure. The Mesoamerican Popol Vuh, sacred text of the Quiché Maya, describes an earlier age of humanity destroyed by a great flood, with a small number of survivors going on to repopulate the world. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, some of which researchers now believe may preserve genuine memory of coastline changes going back over 7,000 years, include stories of ancestral floods reshaping the land. Versions of the same basic structure, a world before, a flood, a handful of survivors, a world after, appear in the folklore of cultures on nearly every inhabited continent, most of which had no contact with each other at the time these stories were first being told.
The mainstream explanation is elegant, and it doesn't require a single global cataclysm at all. As the last ice age ended, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over several thousand years, not instantly, but fast enough, in places, to be noticeable within a single human lifetime, forcing coastal communities to relocate again and again as the water crept inward. Virtually every culture on every coastline on Earth would have lived through some version of this, independently, and virtually every culture would have needed some way to explain it. A flood myth isn't a strange coincidence in that light. It's close to inevitable.
Hancock's reading layers something additional on top of that. He doesn't dispute the science of post-glacial sea level rise, but he argues the sheer consistency of the story structure, the recurring detail of an advanced or blessed world before, destroyed suddenly, survived by only a few, hints at something more specific than gradual coastal displacement. something closer to a shared trauma passed down across the wreckage of a single lost culture, rather than dozens of unrelated cultures independently processing the same slow-moving environmental reality in similar ways.
Neither explanation requires the other to be false. It's entirely possible that both are true at once, that rising seas gave nearly every coastal culture its own flood story to tell, and that somewhere in the deepest layer of that shared human memory, there's an older, more specific echo still waiting to be properly understood. Chapter 12. Where Hancock thinks religion came from. Here's a side of Hancock's work that gets far less coverage than the pyramids and the comets, and it might be the most personal part of his entire 30-year project. In his book Supernatural, published in 2005, Hancock turns his attention away from lost cities entirely and toward a much older mystery, the sudden, dramatic explosion of symbolic art that appears in the archaeological record roughly 40,000 years ago. Cave paintings across Europe, carved figurines, complex burial rituals, behavior that looks, for the first time in the human story, unmistakably like religion, myth, and structured belief, appearing abruptly in a species that had existed in roughly its current biological form for over 100,000 years without leaving behind anything like it.
Hancock's proposed answer draws on his own extensive, publicly discussed personal experience with ayahuasca, a psychoactive brew used ceremonially by indigenous communities across the Amazon for generations. He argues that early humans' encounters with naturally occurring psychoactive plants may have triggered the very first genuinely altered states of consciousness our species experienced, and that those experiences, terrifying, transcendent, utterly unlike ordinary waking life, may be the actual root of humanity's earliest concepts of spirits, gods, and an unseen world sitting just behind the visible one. In his reading, the strange, otherworldly figures painted on cave walls 40,000 years ago aren't abstract art. They're closer to eyewitness sketches, attempts by early humans to record something they'd genuinely seen during an experience unlike anything else in their ordinary lives.
It's a theory that sits, again, well outside mainstream archaeology, which generally attributes the sudden flourishing of symbolic behavior to a gradual accumulation of cognitive and social complexity, larger, more interconnected human groups, more complex language, and more elaborate cultural transmission between generations, rather than any single triggering substance or event. But it's also one of the few places in Hancock's entire body of work where the argument isn't really about a specific ruin or a specific date. It's a question about the origin of belief itself, and it's arguably the idea that's followed him the longest, running quietly underneath almost everything else he's written since. Chapter 13. The Night the Debate Finally Happened. Now, the story we opened with tonight. For over a year, Graham Hancock and a young archaeologist named Flint Dibble had been circling each other publicly. Dibble writing critical pieces about ancient apocalypse, Hancock responding on social media. Both men, at different points, publicly requesting a direct, moderated conversation on the Joe Rogan Experience, the podcast that had already hosted Hancock more than a dozen times and reaches an audience in the tens of millions. The debate was originally scheduled for October 2023. It was postponed when Dibble requested more time to prepare, and Hancock publicly, graciously agreed to the delay. It finally happened in April 2024, as episode 2136 of the podcast, a single continuous conversation running roughly 4.5 hours, released to the public in full, unedited.
What followed was, by most independent accounts,
a genuinely substantive exchange, not a shouting match, but two very differently trained minds working through the same body of evidence live, in real time, with Rogan himself repeatedly pushing both men to show their actual evidence rather than simply restate their positions. At one particularly tense point in the conversation, Hancock referenced past personal criticism from Dibble that he felt had unfairly linked his work to prejudiced ideologies, and the exchange grew heated enough that Rogan called a short break to let both men reset. Immediately afterward, Hancock's public reaction was notably warm. He messaged Dibble directly to say he'd been genuinely impressed by how well Dibble had argued his position. For a few weeks, it looked like the debate might actually end in something rare for this topic: mutual, if grudging, respect.
That matters because it's the exact same instinct he later turned on archaeology itself. Something shifted in the early 1990s. He started writing about ancient mysteries instead of modern ones, beginning with a book chasing the legend of the lost Ark of the Covenant across Ethiopia. From there, his focus kept drifting backward in time and outward into more and more speculative territory. Over the following 3 decades, he published more than a dozen books, each one building on the last, converging on a single enormous claim: that somewhere in the deep past, there existed a civilization sophisticated enough to leave its mark on nearly every ancient culture we know of, and that mainstream archaeology had either missed it or was refusing to look.
Then, months later, the tone shifted sharply. Hancock went public, claiming that new information had come to light, suggesting Dibble had misrepresented certain data during the debate. Specifically, a figure Dibble cited relating to the number of known ancient shipwrecks, which Hancock and his supporters argued had been used to unfairly undercut arguments for ancient long-distance seafaring. Hancock characterized it publicly as being conned during the exchange. Dibble's supporters countered that the discrepancy was a minor, honestly made clerical mix-up in the middle of a 4-hour, evidence-dense conversation, not a deliberate deception, and pointed out that it didn't meaningfully change the substance of Dibble's broader argument. And then came the detail that opened tonight's episode. In a follow-up appearance on the podcast that October, discussing his newly released second season of Ancient Apocalypse, Hancock, in the course of the conversation, acknowledged something that outside observers seized on immediately: that in every location archaeologists have actually physically excavated and studied in detail, they have found no direct evidence supporting his advanced Ice Age civilization. His argument, as he's continued to frame it since, is that the civilization's true remains are most likely sitting in places nobody has excavated yet, beneath still unexplored terrain, or underwater, off coastlines drowned by that same post-glacial sea level rise we talked about earlier tonight. Critics call that an unfalsifiable position, a theory that can never be disproven, because any absence of evidence simply gets explained as, "we haven't looked in the right place yet." Hancock and his supporters call it simply being honest about how much of the ancient world genuinely remains unexplored. Whichever way you read that single admission, it's the most candid moment in 30 years of this argument, a rare instance of the debate's central figure saying plainly, on the record, exactly where the actual physical evidence currently stands. Chapter 14. Where the Story Stands Tonight. So here's where we actually are as of right now. Season 2 of Ancient Apocalypse has already released, expanding Hancock's argument into the Americas. Danny Hillman Natawijaya and his colleagues continue to defend their reading of Gunung Padang even after the retraction. Robert Schock, more than 30 years on, still stands by his water erosion reading of the Sphinx enclosure. and the broader archaeological community continues to publish, in ordinary academic journals, a steady stream of genuinely new discoveries about how sophisticated, organized, and impressive ancient hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies actually were. Discoveries that, ironically, keep making the official ancient world look more advanced and more interesting than the flattened, simplistic version Hancock often argues against.
Maybe that's the real, quiet shift happening underneath 30 years of noise. Not was there a lost civilization, something closer to this. The accepted picture of our ancient ancestors keeps getting more impressive every single year, evidence first, one careful excavation at a time, even without a single lost Ice Age supercivilization required to explain it. Whether that steady, cautious, evidence-led correction is enough to satisfy an audience of millions who felt watching Netflix in 2022 that something bigger was being kept from them, that's still an open question. And it might be the most important open question in this entire story.
Chapter 15. The Sky Mapped Onto the Sand. Stand on the Giza Plateau at night and look up at the 3 stars that make up Orion's belt. Then look down at the 3 pyramids sitting on the ground in front of you. In the late 1980s, an engineer named Robert Balval noticed something that would become one of the most widely repeated claims in the entire lost civilization genre. The layout of the 3 main Giza pyramids seems to mirror the layout of those 3 stars, not just roughly, but with the same subtle offset in relative size and spacing that you see in the sky itself. The smallest pyramid sits slightly off the main diagonal line, exactly the way the dimmest of the 3 stars in Orion's belt sits slightly off the line formed by the other 2.
Balval took it further. He proposed that the pyramids were deliberately positioned to reflect the position Orion's belt would have occupied in the sky around 10,500 BCE, thousands of years before their accepted construction date, and argued that this stellar alignment, along with the pyramid's near-perfect orientation to true north, pointed toward a much older architectural plan, conceived by a much older civilization, that the pharaohs who eventually built the pyramids we see today were, in his reading, simply completing or re-encoding. This became known as the Orion correlation theory, and Hancock adopted it enthusiastically, weaving it through several of his books as one of the clearest examples of ancient monuments encoding astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. It didn't hold up well under closer scrutiny. In 1999, the BBC's science strand Horizon dedicated an episode to testing the theory and brought in an astronomer named Tony Farrell to actually run the numbers. Farrell found that while the pyramid's alignment to true north is genuinely, remarkably precise, within a fraction of a degree, a real and still impressive feat of ancient engineering, the claimed match to Orion's belt was considerably less exact than advertised, off by more than 5 degrees once you accounted for the actual historical shift in the star's apparent position over time. To make the point land for a television audience, the same episode had researchers demonstrate that you could map the stars of the constellation Leo onto famous New York City landmarks with a similarly loose, close enough if you squint fit, not because Manhattan secretly encodes ancient star knowledge, but because human pattern recognition is extremely good at finding matches you go looking for, especially with a little rotation and resizing allowed.
None of that has slowed the theory's popularity. It's a genuinely satisfying idea, a monument you can visit, standing directly beneath the exact stars it supposedly mirrors. But it's a useful early lesson for tonight's episode, because a version of this same pattern, a real, precise, uncontested fact, paired with a much looser, more debatable interpretation layered on top of it, is about to show up again and again at nearly every site we visit tonight.
Chapter 16. The City Built on Water. Off the eastern shore of Pohnpei, a small island in Micronesia, sits one of the strangest cities ever built by human hands, Nan Madol. Roughly 100 artificial islets, constructed from massive, naturally hexagonal basalt columns, stacked log cabin style, some of the individual stones weighing several tons, all of it built directly on top of a coral reef lagoon and threaded through with tidal canals, earning it the nickname the Venice of the Pacific.
Here's the part that's easy to miss if you only know him from headlines. Hancock never claims to have a science degree, and he doesn't pretend to. He's always described himself the same way, a journalist, someone following a story, not a professor defending a thesis. To his fans, that's exactly why he should be trusted, an outsider, unafraid to ask questions credentialed insiders won't. To his critics, it's exactly why he shouldn't be, someone drawing sweeping conclusions about a field he was never trained in. Both of those things are true at once, and that tension is the engine of everything that follows tonight. By the time his book Fingerprints of the Gods came out in the mid-90s, he had a bestseller on his hands. By 2015, its sequel doubled down on a much sharper, much more specific claim, one built around a single, catastrophic night.
Archaeologists date the main construction of Nan Madol to somewhere between the 12th and 13th centuries, genuinely medieval by world standards, built by the ancestors of the Pohnpeian people as the ceremonial and political center of the Saudelor dynasty, a real, historically documented ruling lineage passed down in detailed oral tradition that survives to this day among Pohnpeians. The engineering involved, quarrying, transporting, and stacking those enormous basalt columns without any written record of cranes or metal tools, remains a genuinely impressive, actively studied achievement in its own right.
When Ancient Apocalypse featured Nan Madol, Hancock raised questions about how a society without draft animals, wheeled vehicles, or metal tools could move stones of that size, and suggested the site might be considerably older than its accepted dating, potentially connected to his broader lost civilization framework.
The response from experts in Pacific archaeology and Pohnpeian history was sharper than almost anywhere else in this entire debate. Researchers pointed out that Pohnpeians themselves have a rich, detailed, continuously maintained oral history explaining exactly who built Nan Madol and why. Their own ancestors, not a vanished outside civilization. And argued that suggesting otherwise, however unintentionally, echoes a very old and specifically damaging pattern. 19th and early 20th century European and American researchers repeatedly refusing to credit non-European peoples with their own greatest architectural achievements, instead inventing lost white, Atlantean, or extraterrestrial builders to explain them away.
Great Zimbabwe in southern Africa was misattributed to Phoenician traders for decades on almost exactly this reasoning, before radiocarbon dating and honest scholarship confirmed it was built entirely by the ancestors of the Shona people who still live in the region today. Critics argue that reopening that same "who really built it" question at Nan Madol, regardless of intent, risks repeating that same old, damaging move.
Hancock has responded that his questions are about engineering methods and possible chronology, not about denying Pohnpeian heritage, and has stated publicly that he supports indigenous peoples' history and rights. It's one of the more genuinely uncomfortable corners of this whole story, a place where good faith curiosity about how was this built runs directly into a much older, much more painful history of who gets credited with building anything at all.
Chapter 17. The Temples That Might Be Twice Their Age. A shorter stop now, on the island of Malta, home to some of the oldest confirmed freestanding stone structures on Earth, a cluster of megalithic temples, including sites called Gigantia and Hagar Kim, generally dated by archaeologists to somewhere between 3600 and 2500 BCE. That's already remarkable, older than Stonehenge, older than the Giza pyramids, built by a Neolithic farming culture on a small Mediterranean island roughly 5,000 years ago. In Ancient Apocalypse, Hancock proposed pushing that date back much further, arguing the temples might actually have been constructed around 10,000 years earlier, during the last ice age, based partly on the layout of certain features and their possible alignment to celestial events from that much earlier period. Maltese archaeologists, the people who have spent entire careers excavating, cataloging, and dating these sites, rejected the claim quickly and specifically, pointing to a well-established, continuous archaeological record on the island that simply has no material evidence, no tools, no settlements, no burials, from a period 10,000 years earlier. It's a good example, in miniature, of a pattern that keeps recurring across these chapters. A genuinely old, genuinely impressive, well-documented site that already earns its place in any honest history of human achievement, without needing to be pushed back further into a timeline the physical evidence doesn't support.
Chapter 18. A Road in the Shallows, a Mountain in Mexico. Off the coast of Bimini, in the Bahamas, divers in the 1960s found something that immediately caught the public imagination: a long, straight formation of flat, rectangular limestone blocks, roughly half a mile long, sitting in shallow water just off North Bimini Island. It became known as the Bimini Road, and given the region's folklore connection to the legendary lost continent of Atlantis, some researchers, and later Hancock himself, proposed it might be the remains of an ancient, submerged man-made structure.
Geologists who've studied the formation in detail generally offer a much more mundane explanation. The blocks are made of beach rock, a naturally occurring limestone that forms in distinctive, straight, rectangular slabs as a direct result of ordinary tidal and wave action cementing beach sediment over time. And similar beach rock formations, with the same straight-edged, tile-like appearance, occur naturally along coastlines around the world with no human involvement whatsoever. Radiocarbon and other dating methods applied to the Bimini Formation have generally returned ages consistent with natural beach rock formation within the last few thousand years, not an Ice Age megastructure.
Now to Cholula, in central Mexico, home to the largest pyramid by volume anywhere on Earth, larger even than the Great Pyramid of Giza, though far less famous, in part because a Spanish colonial church was built directly on top of it in the 16th century, and much of the ancient structure is now buried beneath the hill the church sits on. Archaeologists have traced continuous construction and rebuilding at Cholula across an extraordinarily long span, roughly the last 2,500 years, with successive cultures adding new layers on top of older ones over many centuries. A genuine, well-documented, and honestly astonishing example of sustained civilizational effort. Hancock's segment on Cholula focused on the mystery of exactly what triggered its very earliest construction phase, questioning whether the earliest layers might connect to his broader catastrophe narrative. Archaeologists studying the site generally attribute its origins to the same well-documented Mesoamerican building traditions responsible for other major pyramids in the region, with no need for an outside catastrophic trigger.
Chapter 2. The Night the World Almost Ended. Picture the world 12,900 years ago. The last ice age is ending. Vast sheets of ice, some of them over a mile thick, are still gripping huge portions of North America and Europe. Sea levels sit more than 100 meters lower than they do today, which means entire stretches of coastline that are underwater right now were dry land back then. Places we now think of as ocean floor used to be somebody's home. And then, according to Hancock's theory, something happened. A rapid, violent cooling event struck the planet, undoing the slow warming that had been happening for thousands of years and plunging much of the northern hemisphere back into a deep freeze for roughly a millennium. Geologists call this period the Younger Dryas, and its existence isn't controversial at all. It's a well-documented shift in the climate record, visible in ice cores and lake sediments around the world. What is controversial is why it happened, and what Hancock believes it destroyed.
Chapter 19. The Layer in the Ground. We touched on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis across the last 2 episodes in fairly broad strokes. Tonight, it's worth actually looking at the physical evidence itself, because this is the part of Hancock's theory built most directly on published, peer-reviewed science, and it's more interesting and more contested than a passing mention can really capture.
In 2007, a research team led by physicist Richard Firestone published a paper proposing that a distinctive, thin, dark sediment layer found at numerous sites across North America, often called the Black Mat, marked the exact moment the Younger Dryas cooling began, roughly 12,900 years ago. Buried within that layer, they reported, was a cluster of unusual physical evidence, tiny diamond fragments called nanodiamonds, which on Earth typically only form under the extreme pressure and heat of an impact event, along with magnetic spherules and elevated levels of iridium, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Later research by other teams reported an unusually sharp spike in platinum at the same sediment layer in ice cores drilled in Greenland. Again, a signature some researchers argued was more consistent with an extraterrestrial impact than any known terrestrial process.
Taken together, this became the core physical case for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, and it's genuinely serious, peer-reviewed science published by credentialed researchers in respected journals, not internet speculation.
It's also been fought over intensely for nearly 2 decades. Multiple independent research teams have attempted to replicate the original nanodiamond and platinum findings at the same or similar sites, with notably mixed results. Some labs reporting they simply couldn't find comparable concentrations of these materials in samples from the same layers, and raising concerns about contamination or misidentification of the original samples. The large 2023 rebuttal we mentioned in Part 1, representing dozens of specialists across geology, physics, and climate science, argued that across the full body of evidence gathered over more than 15 years, the impact signature hasn't held up to rigorous, independent scrutiny, and that the Younger Dryas cooling event is more likely explained by a large, sudden release of cold, fresh water from a collapsing ice-dammed lake in North America, disrupting the ocean currents that regulate the Northern Hemisphere's climate, a well-understood mechanism that doesn't require a comet at all.
Proponents of the impact hypothesis, including geologist Randall Carlson, who has appeared alongside Hancock discussing this research for years, argue the rebuttal is too quick to dismiss a genuinely strong body of anomalous evidence, and that the debate remains legitimately open within the scientific literature, rather than settled in either direction. What's true, without dispute, on both sides, this is one of the very few places in this entire story where Hancock isn't reaching for folklore, star alignments, or contested rock formations. He's pointing at an actual ongoing argument happening inside professional geology journals. He's simply betting on the minority position within that argument, rather than the majority one.
Chapter 20. Why he says he's really doing this. Here's a piece of the story that gets lost entirely once the conversation turns to pyramids and radiocarbon dates. Hancock has been remarkably consistent for decades about what he says the actual point of all this research is. Not proving a lost civilization existed for its own sake, warning the present one. His argument runs like this. If a comet or a swarm of cometary fragments really did strike Earth roughly 12,900 years ago, triggering a period of catastrophic climate disruption severe enough to end an entire civilization, then the uncomfortable follow-up question is simple. Could it happen again? Not as ancient history, as a live, ongoing risk to the civilization we're living in right now.
And on that narrower point, that large objects from space genuinely do strike Earth and have done so within recorded human history, there's no controversy at all. In 1908, an explosion over the Tunguska region of Siberia, almost certainly caused by a small asteroid or comet fragment exploding in the atmosphere before reaching the ground, flattened roughly 800 square miles of forest, an area larger than many major cities, with a blast estimated at hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It happened over a remote, sparsely populated region. Had it happened a few hours later, given the Earth's rotation, it could have struck a major European city instead. More recently, in February 2013, a smaller meteor exploded over Chelyabinsk, Russia, injuring over 1,000 people, mostly from shattered window glass, and serving as a very public, very modern reminder that the sky is not, in fact, a settled and finished place.
Space agencies around the world now maintain active near-Earth object tracking programs, specifically because of this risk, cataloging and monitoring asteroids and comets whose orbits bring them close to our planet. That infrastructure exists because the scientific community broadly agrees the underlying risk is real, even if the odds of a civilization-ending impact in any given century remain extremely low.
Hancock's framing takes that real, agreed-upon risk and layers his own historical argument on top of it, that we've already lived through one such catastrophe as a species, forgotten it almost entirely, rebuilt from nothing, and are now, in his view, dangerously complacent about the possibility of it happening again. Whether or not you accept his reading of the deep past, this is arguably the most quietly compelling part of his entire 30-year project. Not, here's what happened to them, but here's what could still happen to us, and we're not nearly as prepared as we assume we are.
Chapter 21. Not Ancient Aliens. One last piece of context worth settling clearly, because the two ideas get confused constantly online, and Hancock himself has spent real energy pushing back against the comparison. In 1968, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods, proposing that many of humanity's ancient monuments and religious traditions were actually inspired by visits from extraterrestrial beings mistaken by early humans for gods. It became enormously popular and effectively founded what's now known as the ancient astronaut genre, the idea, still alive today in shows discussing supposed ancient alien intervention, that outside, non-human visitors are the real explanation behind humanity's greatest achievements.
His argument goes like this. A comet, or a swarm of comet fragments, struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere around this time. The impact, he says, would have triggered continent-scale wildfires, thrown enormous amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere, and catastrophically destabilized the ice sheets, unleashing floods on a scale almost impossible to picture. Not a bad storm season, a civilization-ending event. Hancock has been explicit, repeatedly, across interviews and his own writing, that this is not his theory, and he's often visibly frustrated at being lumped in with it. His lost civilization is entirely human. No aliens,
no extraterrestrial visitors, no non-human intelligence involved at any point. His argument is that human beings, on Earth, achieved a level of sophistication earlier than we currently believe, and that a natural catastrophe, not an alien departure, is what erased the record of it. It's a meaningfully different claim from von Daniken's, even though casual observers, and no small number of critics, frequently collapse the two into the same broad category of fringe theory about ancient mysteries.
The distinction matters for understanding exactly what kind of pushback each theory attracts. Von Daniken's ancient astronaut theory is generally dismissed by archaeologists for the same reason critics raised about Nan Madol earlier tonight. It frequently implies that historical human societies weren't capable of their own greatest achievements without outside help, a claim many researchers consider not just factually unsupported, but genuinely disrespectful to the actual builders. Hancock's theory, whatever else is disputed about it, keeps the achievement entirely human. His argument has never been that people couldn't have built these things. It's that a different, earlier group of people already did, long before the ones history currently gives credit to.
Chapter 22. Where This Leaves Us. 3 episodes in now, and the pattern by this point should be fairly clear. Almost every site in this story starts with something genuinely, uncontroversially remarkable. A hilltop temple older than farming itself. A stone cut with a precision modern engineers still study. A coastline mapped with an accuracy that shouldn't have been possible yet. A sediment layer carrying a genuinely strange chemical signature. None of that is invented. All of it is real, checkable, and worth being fascinated by entirely on its own terms.
What happens next, again and again, is a choice about how far to carry that fascination. Mainstream archaeology generally stops at the edge of what the direct physical evidence can support, even when that leaves real, unresolved mysteries sitting there unexplained. Hancock consistently carries the story one step further into a unifying explanation that ties dozens of separate mysteries into a single, coherent, sweeping narrative. A lost world, a forgotten catastrophe, a debt we don't know we're still carrying.
Neither impulse is unreasonable on its own. Caution protects a field from chasing every intriguing coincidence into a conclusion the evidence can't actually hold. Big unifying questions are how genuine breakthroughs get chased down in the first place, including plenty of ones we now take for granted. The real story here, after 3 episodes, was never really about who's completely right and who's completely wrong. It's about watching, site by site, exactly where careful evidence ends, and where a very old, very human hunger to connect the dots all the way to a single, satisfying answer quietly begins.
Chapter 23. The Country Under the North Sea. For nearly 100 years, fishing trawlers working the North Sea between modern Britain and the Netherlands have occasionally hauled up something strange in their nets alongside the usual catch: mammoth teeth, antlers, and more than once, a genuine human tool, carved from bone or antler by hands that held it thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. They weren't finding relics that drifted there by accident. They were finding the remains of a real, inhabited landscape, now sitting more than 100 feet underwater. Researchers call it Doggerland, a huge stretch of low hills, marshland, rivers, and forest that once connected Britain to mainland Europe as a single continuous landmass, home to Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities for thousands of years after the last ice age ended. As global sea levels rose through the same broad post-glacial period we've discussed across the last few episodes, Doggerland shrank gradually, decade by decade, its rivers pushed inland, its coastline swallowed piece by piece, until, around 8,200 years ago, A faunal, sudden catastrophe finished the job. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, now called the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that swept across what remained of Doggerland's low-lying coastal regions, very likely within living memory for the people still living there.
Here's what makes this chapter worth including in a story about Graham Hancock, even though it isn't one of his claims at all. Doggerland isn't speculative. It's accepted, mainstream, extensively studied archaeology, reconstructed through actual seafloor core samples, sonar mapping, and dredged artifacts, published in ordinary academic journals for decades. A genuinely inhabited lost land, swallowed by rising seas, and finished off by a single violent event, is not a fringe theory here. It's settled history, sitting quietly, mostly unknown to the general public, underneath a stretch of gray ocean most people cross by ferry without a second thought.
It's worth sitting with that for a second before we go further tonight, because it means the emotional core of Hancock's entire argument, a real society, genuinely erased by rising water and sudden catastrophe, already has at least one confirmed, uncontroversial example in the mainstream record. The disagreement was never really about whether the ocean has ever swallowed an inhabited world. It clearly has, at least once, exactly as described. The disagreement is about how advanced that world was and how many times it happened.
Chapter 24: The Other Sunken Continent. Travel now to the opposite side of the world, and to a theory that runs almost eerily parallel to Hancock's, proposed by someone with a very different professional background. Stephen Oppenheimer is a British physician and geneticist, not a journalist or an alternative historian, who spent years studying the population genetics of Southeast Asia. In 1998, he published a book called Eden in the East, making a striking argument that the modern islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are simply the mountainous remnants of a much larger continuous landmass, now known to researchers as Sunderland, that was gradually flooded as sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, with several catastrophic pulses of especially rapid flooding along the way.